Okay, so we're going to talk about how we learn today. Okay, so the last chapter was intelligence. What does it mean to be smart? How do we measure whether you're smart or not? What are different types of smarts? The learning chapter is about how do we learn information once we know whether somebody's intelligent or not. All right, so what is learning? Psychology defines it as a relatively permanent change in your behavior that results from experience. So learning does not just mean that you learn the definition of terms or you learn the date of a war or something like that. Learning also means everything that you have in your memory source. You learn how to be a human being. You learn what it means to be a boy or a girl. You learn what it means if you vote Republican or Democrat. You learn how to interact in relationships. You learn how to have a successful marriage, or you learn how to have an awful marriage. Okay? You can look at your parents' relationship to decide what you learn. So everything you learn ends up changing how you behave. So if you learn that God exists, it's going to change your behavior in life. If you are taught that God doesn't exist, you'll behave in a different way. So one of the things that we want to do in therapy is figure out what have people learned in their lives and how is it affecting their behavior now. And then can we reteach them so that it changes their behavior. For instance, when I do domestic violence counseling with batterers, I teach them what a healthy relationship is like because they don't have a clue. So it's no wonder that they get into all of these unhealthy relationships. So they have to relearn what does it mean to have a good relationship. Most of them have never experienced one. So again, I've talked about this before, we're interested in both the content and the process of learning. And we're going to talk about the process in this chapter. Content is what you learn. Process is how you're learning it. And to psychologists, the process of learning is much more interesting than the content of learning. Because we're all learning things in pretty much the same way, which means you can also relearn things using the same methods. And we're going to talk about how you learn how to interact in a relationship and how you can teach your kids how to follow rules and so on. These are the three types of learning we're going to talk about. Classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and then the cognitive and social types of learning. Has anybody heard of classical conditioning? Does the name Pavlov ring a bell? You got that. Very good. You see what I did there? Okay. All right, so let's start with classical conditioning. Here's some examples. You open a can of cat food. Anybody have cats? Okay. What does your cat do?
She gets excited.
Gets excited and runs over. Okay? Same thing happens when you tap the can. Does a feral cat know what the sound of a can of cat food opening means? No. So if you went into some alley somewhere with feral cats and you opened a can of cat food, would they all come running? No. So they have to learn what this means. And how they're learning it is through what we call classical conditioning, where you pair two things together and they learn thing A means that thing B is coming. And I'll explain in more detail as we go. Okay, so classical conditioning, discovered by a guy named Ivan Pavlov. He was Russian. He was actually not a psychologist. He was a physiologist. He got a Nobel Prize in physiology. And he studied the digestion of dogs. Okay? We'll get into that. Okay. So what he was doing was he was looking at, when I present a dog with food, how much do they salivate? And he was looking to see how much salivation helps with the digestion process, which we know it is the first step in digestion because your saliva has all sorts of enzymes that help to break down food. But what he wasn't trying to study and ended up studying was that when he gave the dog food, over time, the dog would start to salivate before he was presented with the food, when the food was being made. When the laboratory assistants were heading into the lab and the dog heard the door open, he'd start to salivate. When he heard the laboratory workers walking down the stairs around feeding time, he'd start to salivate. And so Pavlov was really fascinated by this and started to look at what else can I use to get this dog to salivate. And what is the most famous? The bell. The bell. Okay, so you ring a bell and the dog will start to drool. So we're going to talk about how that ended up happening. So when we talk about classical conditioning, there are 4 components. It's actually 5 components you need to know, but I don't think I have the 5th one there. No, I don't. Okay. 4 main components. You have, first of all, you have a stimulus and you have a response. What does it mean? What does stimulus mean? Excitement. Something that provokes a reaction, right? So a stimulus could be, I poked you with a needle. It's excitement in the sense that you get the bodily arousal, you get adrenaline pumping. There's something that causes a response. So you have a stimulus and you have response. Then we break it down into conditioned and unconditioned. Unconditioned means natural, like unconditioned hair, frizzy and all tangled and everything. Conditioned is it's been trained. Learning has taken place. So an unconditioned stimulus is something that naturally creates a response. You don't need to learn anything. So if I brought in some freshly baked chocolate chip cookies and you smell that scent wafting on the air, okay? So her smile is what we would call an unconditioned response. She doesn't need to be trained in order to, like, her stomach starts growling and she wants that cookie. It smells good. It's a reflexive action, a reflexive reaction to a natural stimulus. Okay? So you get hungry when you smell good things. Nobody needs to teach you that. It's unconditioned. Okay? So a conditioned stimulus is now I train you that this means blah, blah, blah. So maybe every time I wear a certain shirt, you know that the next class I'm going to be in a baking mood and bring cookies. The shirt itself doesn't naturally mean anything, but over time you learn that this predicts something else is going to come. So now you've been conditioned, you've been trained to learn X means Z is coming. So for instance, if you are in an abusive home, you may know the signals that says that this person is going to abuse today. Because abusers don't abuse every single day, right? There's some sign. They come home with the smell of alcohol on them. They slam the door in a certain way and you know, holy cow, it's coming today, right? And even in milder situations, we can predict when somebody's going to be in a bad mood. If I come home and my mom is baking macaronis and cheese, I know she's had a bad day. Okay? Does macaronis and cheese naturally mean that the baker is stressed out? No. Okay? And in your household, it may not mean that at all. But in my household, I know consistently, if that's being baked, mama ain't happy. Okay? So that becomes a conditioned stimulus, and then my anxiety after that becomes a conditioned response. Okay? Macaroni and cheese does not cause anxiety in everybody. All right, I'll show you this video. Hopefully the sound is up.
Behavioral psychologists have come up with new views, not only of animal behavior, but of human nature as well. And these views all concern a process that we take for granted, learning, because we are all truly born to learn. Ironically, one of the most important figures in the study of learning, Ivan Pavlov, wasn't concerned with the subject at all, at least not at first. Pavlov, a noted Russian scientist, won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 1904. As this original footage shows, Pavlov was initially interested in digestion and the action of the salivary glands. By diverting the saliva of dogs into test tubes, he could precisely measure if and how much they salivated during digestion. When food was presented, the dog salivated quickly, an inherited salivary reflex. But over repeated testings, a strange thing happened. The dog salivated before contact with the food. Just the sight of the food was enough to stimulate their drooling. Then, just seeing the food dish, or even hearing the footsteps of Pavlov or his assistants, was enough to trigger this built-in reflex. What was going on to elicit this response? Pavlov decided to find out by systematically varying the stimuli and measuring the dog's reaction. Metronomes, lights, and bells were all used as stimuli, and they all worked as stand-ins for the food. What mattered was not the kind of stimulus that was used, but the fact that it reliably signaled that food was on the way. Pavlov had discovered a fundamental type of learning called classical conditioning. An original stimulus elicits an automatic, unlearned response. Both stimulus and response happen naturally. They are unconditioned. Then a second, neutral stimulus that never elicits the unconditioned response by itself is introduced just before the presentation of the original stimulus. If the neutral or signaling stimulus is presented alone, and a response occurs as if the original stimulus were still there, we say that conditioning has taken place. The arbitrary neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. The reverse is also true. Pavlov and others studied the extinction over time of such conditioned responses. When the subject learns that the conditioned stimulus no longer signals a desired event, the acquisition process is reversed, as the learned connection is gradually weakened. Pavlov's work, and the work of those who followed him, led to a remarkable conclusion, and that is, any stimulus an organism can perceive is capable of eliciting any reaction the organism is capable of making. This means that virtually any sound, sight, or smell can influence the way our muscles tense or relax, our moods fluctuate, or even the way our attitudes are formed. For instance, if I say, relax, and then do this, you're going to be startled and upset. After 5 or 6 pairings of relax, just saying the word relax is going to generate a negative response rather than its usual learned reaction.
I'd like to see him fire off a gun at a university today. Although he is the Philip Zimbardo, so he might get away with that. Philip Zimbardo is a super famous psychologist. He's done some amazing studies like the Stanford Prison Experiment. Anybody heard of that? Yeah? That's an awesome experiment. So he took college students, randomly assigned them to the prison guard or the prisoner group, and then he put them in a fake prison in the basement of the psychology building at Stanford. And it got so abusive. It was supposed to be a 2-week-long project, and the prison guards became so abusive, and the prisoners became so mentally screwed up that they called it quits after 6 days. It was an interesting, really interesting experiment. All right, so this is classical conditioning, okay? So let's look at the original Pavlov experiment. Who studied digestion in dogs. He presented the meat or the dog food to the dog, measured the salivation, and over time the dog started to salivate prior to getting the food. The question of why is answered by what Pavlov called classical conditioning. Okay, so here's how it went. The food causes a reflexive response of salivation, drooling. Okay? So is the food a stimulus or response? It's stimulus. Food isn't a response to anything, right? It stimulates a response. It causes a response. So the stimulus is food. The response to food is drooling. Okay? Dog drools when it has food. Does it require any training to teach the dog you should start to drool once I give you food?
No.
No. So this is what we would call unconditioned. An unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. It is reflexive. It doesn't require any learning. It's natural. What is the bell? The tone. The stimulus. Very good. The kind of stimulus is what we call a neutral stimulus. Because if I go home to my dogs and I ring a bell in their face, what are they going to do?
Stare at you?
Stare at me. They'll probably jump all over me and, well, they'll drool on me because they're bloodhounds and they drool all the time anyways. Okay. So, but a regular dog, my dogs are just drooling all the time. But let me tell you, when there's food in front of them, their drool, they're amazing. Like they're about that tall and the drool can get all the way to the ground without falling off. It's No.
I have St. Bernards. So
Oh, you know them.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that drill is impressive. So regular drill in these dogs is different than food drill. Okay. So a typical dog, you ring a bell in their face, and they're not going to react, except for like, well, what are you doing, you weirdo? Okay. So Pavlov trained the dog to respond to a neutral stimulus. Okay, that's the idea. So what do we have to do to the dog to train it to respond to a stimulus that means nothing to them? To a bell. You offer them food, you just give them food.
You do it at the same time.
You do it at the same time, okay, or at least close to each other. The most efficient way to train it is you do the neutral stimulus first, and then immediately after you give the unconditioned stimulus. Okay, so you ring the bell, you present them with food. And you do it over and over again until they have paired those things. Okay? This is what we call acquisition. Okay? They have acquired the learning. They've learned the bell means food is coming.